This is the Commonwealth, where we talk with creators of disruptive change. For this episode, we're talking with Davidson. After starting, scaling, and selling a WordPress hosting site called Flywheel, Dusty has recently co-founded a communication software company called Workshop. Dusty, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yes, Dusty, I first talked to you almost a year and a half ago, and it was right after Flywheel sold to WordPress Engine.
Yep.
And I am just really excited to touch base with you a year and a half later, because it seems like a lot is happening in your world.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when we last spoke, we'd gone through the deal, we'd sold the company, and we were just kind of like figuring out, what does that even mean? Like, what's this sort of new world, you know, after having been acquired, and, you know, spent frankly about the last year and a half working through that and transitioning the two companies to come more closely together and make sure the teams were set up for success. And then, you know, ultimately decided, you know, it was time for, kind of time for something new.
Yes, yeah. Has enough time passed for you to like reflect on that acquisition, and like how would you say it went looking back on it?
Well, I think that all acquisitions have their challenges, right? Like, there's just like two organizations that have their own cultures and their own way of doing things and their own scale kind of coming together. And I think that generally speaking, we did a really good thing and kind of like not changing anything for almost or over a year, actually. And generally speaking, we kind of like left everything alone. It's like, don't break the toy you bought, sort of thing. And that got us to be able to get to know the teams on the other side and vice versa, and understand the humans that were involved. And because, you know, companies are made up of people, and people have, roles to play, and they have their own responsibilities and all this sort of stuff. And like, how do we align visions and all this stuff? And that stuff just takes time. And so, I would say that, I don't know, probably better than average in terms of acquisitions go. We tried to be intentional. We tried to be thoughtful. We tried to be, gracious with the teams and with the customers, and make sure that, everything was set up in good hands. I think we did a reasonably good job of that.
What was your biggest lesson learned that if you were to do it over again, what was the biggest lesson from this last time?
Yeah, I think that, so the acquisition, from the time we got contacted to the time we closed and there was money in the bank, was about 60 days, which is a really fast process. And there's good parts about a fast process. You're not distracted, you're not wasting a lot of time, you can get back to work, all these sorts of things. That part is really good. But I would have liked to have spent more time kind of on like, what's the plan? Yeah. And you're like, okay, because we kind of got to the end of it and we're like, all right, like now what?
Yeah.
And so like the day after, we're sitting here going like, well, I guess we just kind of keep doing the same thing. I would have liked to have a bit more of a plan. But on the flip side, you know, again, there's value in moving quickly, and there's value in just kind of like figuring it out as you go along. But I think that's probably the biggest learning and takeaway.
Yes, yeah. And when was your last day at Flywheel? Because you're now the CEO and co-founder of Workshop. When did you depart Flywheel, and if you could just provide context on like that decision?
Yeah, so my last day was on February 1st of this year, 2021. Okay. And we probably came to terms with that and sort of started planning for that towards the end of last year. And it's a reasonable transition. I think it's a high impact on the teams. There was kind of a lot of change happening going on, and so a lot of change management, and you wanted to give enough time and notice so that you could build a great sort of exit path, and that the exit is sort of celebratory and kind of representative of all the great work that we've all done together, but at the same time not so far in the future that anybody's like languishing or anything like that. And so probably we probably spent 3 or 4 months planning and figuring out what does that exit look like. And ultimately, myself and my partner Rick left at the same time, and a handful of others left around that same time. And like I said, I think we felt like the teams were in good hands, and the customers were in good hands, and the products were in good hands.
Yes, yeah, and so I want to get into workshop here. Like next question, when did you assess? So I think I guess to start with, what exactly is workshop? That like I read online that it's an internal communication tool for companies.
Yep.
But how is that different than Slack or Asana, like the different products out there?
Yeah, so we think of Workshop as a internal communications platform. Really thinking about it as how do you disseminate a company's most important information to the teams, and how do those teams sort of gather around that information? So on the one hand, it's sort of like MailChimp for teams, like sending newsletters and sort of push notifications.
Okay.
On the other hand, it's a kind of modern take on an intranet or a company hub. So how and we think of it as adjacent to Slack and adjacent to email and other places, because if you use Slack, and Flywheel was a huge Slack user, it's awesome in so many ways, except for the ways in which you want to share really important information, because there's so much noise and there's so much chatter going on that, for instance, if you're on vacation and we share the strategy for the quarter in Slack, you're never going to see it. And we look at Workshop as sort of filling that gap. And we had that problem at Flywheel, where after you get past about 100 people, communicating both top down and bottom up, these like really strategic and core kind of like evergreen pieces of information, strategy, goals and OKRs, these kind of things, doesn't have a real home, and there's certainly not a tool for that. We cobbled it together and ultimately kind of like built our own solution. And my partners and I looked at that and said, like, hey, I think there's a real gap there from a solution perspective. Like that's not a solved problem. And so, and I will say that like it's like maybe the number one thing in defining how aligned and engaged a culture is in a company is like, do I understand the strategy? Do I understand where what I do contributes to that strategy? And am I aligned with that? And so like that's super important. There's a super big gap, and we look at Workshop as a solution to that.
Yes, yeah. At which point did you know that Workshop was going to be your next chapter?
Yeah, Rick and I always knew that we were going to do something together. Again, we're young. We're builders. We like building things. We learned a ton at Flywheel about what to do and what not to do. So you'd be kind of like dumb to not do something again in a way. And it was just a question of what and when. And, we got an opportunity to work with two other former Flywheelers who had kind of a nascent idea. And, it ticked a lot of boxes. It ticked a people box. It ticked a kind of like a problem that we had experienced box. It ticked a box where we get to impact cultures of companies. Like that's super interesting. And so yeah, it's kind of like we always knew we were going to do something, and this was a serendipitous kind of coming together of, I think, four people who were excited to work together again.
Yeah, and that coming together, did that take place like around the February timeline, or was this something kind of like on the back burner you were stewing on for longer than that? Or was it like even post like, oh, I'm leaving Flywheel on this day, I have to do something next, let's all start talking?
A little bit of all of it, right? Okay. It's kind of like staggered in a lot of ways, because, I think Ben and Derek had started working on something, and, I think they approached Rick and I were like, hey, would you be interested in investing? Because both Rick and I have done a share of angel investing over the last 2 years. And so like that was certainly an idea and a strategy. But then as we got talking more, it's like, hey, what if we all just came together, and would that create something bigger? Could we raise more money? Could we make a bigger impact? And so that's just kind of staggered over the course of the end of last year all the way through the February timeframe.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, you have described your current team as like bringing the band back together in a few different interviews. How big is that current team now?
So the team right now is 8 people. So 4 founders, and then we've got a handful of other folks in sort of sales and marketing and engineering.
And then did that band? So it seemed like that core group of the two people sort of with the idea that came to you, and then your partner Rick. Is that the core of like the former Flywheel people, or were there more people that from Flywheel that joined? That joined those four people like along with that?
Yeah. So the original, so the four founders, all from Flywheel, Ben and Derek were former Flywheelers. They left to build a company called Median. They ultimately sold that company.
Oh.
And then we're kind of like done with that engagement last year. And so the timing kind of worked out. And then we hired the former head of marketing from Flywheel, Jamie Bell, and an early and former sales rep from Flywheel, Jess Spangler. And so that was the original core team, which was all Flywheel, like had experience at Flywheel. And so in that regard, sort of getting the band back together. But the, it's like once you've worked with great people, it's exciting to work with them again.
Yes. Yeah. What stage is Workshop in? Like, is there a customer base and a product, or are you building out the product? What is the stage of the company?
Yeah, so we've got a sort of a nascent product. It works. It's we've got about a dozen customers using the product, and so that's super exciting. And we just raised $3.5 million, and so
congrats.
We're kind of in that seed stage where. The old adage: if you launch a product and you're not embarrassed by it, then you launch too late. You're like super embarrassed by the product.
Okay.
So I guess that's right.
All right.
And so we're investing a ton into building more product out and figuring out and just talking to a ton of customers and potential customers.
Yeah. What's the current focus right now? Is it in sales or is it product development?
I'd say it's split product development. Like we've got a good roadmap and we know generally what direction we want to go for the next 6+ months. We just need to do that. And then on the other side, it's just having as many customer conversations as you can. And, not all of them are going to end up in sales today because the product's not there or because we don't quite understand the pain points yet. So you're or like what the biggest pain points are. And so you're kind of in this like customer discovery / product development mode until, those two things kind of converge and you kind of like are like, oh man, it like really clicks. We've really figured it out. And so, we're selling, a couple a week now, and you want to kind of accelerate that over the course of the next 6 months.
Yeah. And who's the target customer?
Yeah, we look at it as companies, probably 100 to 500 right now, people on the team. So, they've achieved some scale. They're starting to have these types of communication problems, like these breakdown in things like Slack. They maybe have a dedicated person to internal communications, which probably happens, in my estimation, about 200 people. And then, or maybe HR is handling it, or maybe marketing's handling it. So it's kind of in that sweet spot there.
Yeah, yes. My guess is it's a pretty drastic change in mindset going from running a company with 250 people to starting a company with a team of 8. Is that a correct assumption, or like how much did your gears have to shift?
Yeah, a lot.
A lot.
Yeah. I mean, it went from it was basically running a company at 250 and have all of that responsibility and all of the support network, right? Like I had a full executive team and I had an assistant, like you had all this like support network. To then being an executive at a 1,000-person company after the acquisition, and for a year and a half, I think both Rick and I and several of the others were, on the executive team at the much larger company, and you still had the same support network but different responsibilities. To then saying like, I now run payroll, right? Like,
Yeah.
And so like, it's and like I ran payroll at the beginning of Flywheel, of course, but like that was a long time ago, and thankfully, what's crazy is the tools are way better now. Like you've got platforms that just make a lot of that stuff a lot easier than when we started Flywheel. There weren't great like SaaS platforms for that kind of stuff. And so anyway, it changes dramatically, but I'm just a caveman, but I think I can figure it out.
Okay, fair enough. So as someone who's started multiple companies, is there anything that you're doing now for the first time, like with all of your experience as an entrepreneur, how is this time different, or is it different at all?
Well, it's different in a lot of ways. One is that you're not as naive, and you're not as kind of like dumb, right? Like you've done, but maybe that's a bad thing, right?
Yeah.
Like you maybe overanalyze in a way, and you make different decisions. And in some ways that's good, in some ways that's bad. And so you're doing things different. Like at Flywheel for 3 years, we didn't have salespeople at all. Like we had no salespeople. And people would just come to the website, they'd sign up and buy. And one day we woke up and we're like, oh, there's 2,000 people a month signing up. Like, what if we just called them back? And then we were like, oh, you call them back and you sell them way more. And it's like our growth kind of went like this. We're like, well, shit, like maybe next time we should hire salespeople.
Yeah.
So we did that way earlier. But we did lots of things at Flywheel early on that it kind of, if you did it rationally, you maybe wouldn't do. We were just kind of like young and dumb. And so,
for example, I remember one of your first hires was a videographer.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. That is hilarious.
Like
to me.
hire number one was
Yeah,
a videographer. Yeah. And in fact, then we had a full-time photographer who's still at Flywheel, Kimberly, who we hired as like employee number 15. Like, and so, yeah, those are kind of things that, so one of the things I think a lot about is like, how do you both leverage the experience and the knowledge, right? You want to go faster and you want to build bigger, you want to do better, and you want to work with more experienced people. At the same time, you want this sense of like naivete. Like you're like, you don't want to lose that sense of like F it, let's just hire the recruiter. Like we hired a recruiter at Flywheel at 15 and
at 15 people?
15 people.
Okay.
And he shows up day one and is like, all right, who am I hiring? We're like, we're not hiring anybody. Like, you're going to do support tickets for 2 months. And he's like, whoa, oh, okay. Like, but we found a great recruiter and we're just like, well, we're going to need recruiting someday. Like why not just hire him? I think that's the balance I think is super interesting this time around is like, how do you balance sort of like your experience, your knowledge with like, just like your gut. And I think that's kind of a fun challenge.
How do you swing it back over to the gut occasionally?
Yeah, I think that, I'm a pretty gut driven guy just in general. So like, I think that, and that's done us pretty well over the years. And so, I'm not hyper analytical. I don't need a ton of data to like drive decisions. It's more like, it's more like if you, and I also believe that, and I know that Rick would say this as well, that like all of it's in our own control. Like you're just going, like it's on us to just do it. And so if you believe in something and you're convicted about it, then just do it because like it's yours to kind of like get it there. Like you can always work harder. You can always and you can always change. And so, I think that's probably how it's not that we won't be sort of gut driven and we won't sort of like make bets in ways. It's more just that like, you have more data available to you because you've done things before, so you question it more, if that makes sense.
Yeah. What's the most frustrating part? Like, for example, you mentioned not having an executive assistant. When I reached out for this interview, I asked to speak to your PR team jokingly. Is there anything like that? Like, what's the most frustrating part starting again over from scratch?
I think the most frustrating, but also the most interesting thing for me, it's kind of like two parts. One is, you just haven't figured it out yet. Like you don't know exactly where you live in the market. You don't know exactly who the customer is. You don't, and we had that at Flywheel. Like there was a period of time at Flywheel where we didn't know that, but like there was a very long period of time at Flywheel where you knew that, like where it was like everybody in the company could recite like who the customer is and like why what we do creates value and all these sorts of things. And so that's kind of frustrating. Like it's just like, I just want that. Like I want that to like click so that you can then just like pour fuel on the fire. And the other is kind of like velocity, and it's kind of a side effect of that, which is like, I just want to go faster. Right. And you have to sometimes be like, hey, like it's okay. Like we're okay at the pace we are. We should always push and want to like take it to an 11, but also at the same time, like it's not wrong to not be going a million miles an hour right now.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. You mentioned raising capital. My, again, assumption based on your reputation was that it would have been fairly easy this time around raising capital. How did that go?
Yeah. So my joke is that when Flywheel raised money, we over the course of Flywheel, we raised, I think, $15 million or something in total. The first big round that we did was a seed round of $1.2 million. I think for that round, I talked to 100. My joke is I talked to 100 people and I got 3 people to say yes. And this time around, I sent 3 text messages, and so and raised $3.5 million. And so once you make money for people, then they want to double. Then their answer is yes, 100%. And actually, then what happens is when other people see you make money for other people, then they want in as well. And so we thought a lot about this time about it's we could have raised, I don't know, $20 million, but who do we want on our team? Right? Who creates value? Mm-hmm. Who believed in us last time, and when nobody else did. Because I actually I value that a lot, right? There's some Linseed Capital was the first money in at Flywheel, and you know what? They were they were my first call for workshop, because they believed in us early then, and I think they did well in that deal, and I respect that, and I want to sort of honor that. And then there's others that we worked with that we really enjoyed working with. So Ludlow Ventures out of Detroit, also early Flywheel supporters, but also huge value add. And we just like hanging out with those guys. And so we want to work with them again. And so that was kind of the calculus. Yeah. And it was a lot easier. That's for dang sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Who was the third text message? Linseed, the Detroit, who of the 3 million, who's all in on who are your investors?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's just then it's more than 3 text messages. Okay. There's there's 3 text messages, but not much more. I mean, we could have filled it with 3. It's kind of interesting. And then it was just, again, who do you want on the team? And so it was I would say fundraising sucks a lot. And for anybody listening, who's going through it, I've been there and I've got my teeth kicked in. I've been on planes that produced $0, and then it turned out okay, right? We finally got somebody to say yes, and then once they believe in you, then you build Flywheel, you ultimately sell it, and everybody's really happy. My favorite day at Flywheel was calling all the investors and telling them we sold the company and made them a ton of money. But so fundraising sucks generally, but it gets better. It's easier over time, and this time was pretty good. Yeah.
Earlier you mentioned angel investing, that you have kind of sat on the other side of the table. What companies do you look for when angel investing?
Well, I like SaaS companies, so I like things that I can understand, and that I'd be I could I understand the model. I like founders. I'm a people person. Anybody who I think knows me knows that I enjoy people, and I enjoy kind of all 250 people at Flywheel, I interviewed every one of them. And so I love talking to people and sort of sussing out what people are good at and that sort of thing. And that's no different from founders as well. And so I like strong, confident, driven founders. And so, I look for those kinds of things, and, frankly, just kind of still figuring it out.
So kind of the thing I would like to end on is talking more about Omaha's ecosystem. And as the co-founder of Silicon Prairie News, which is a media outlet that covers the Silicon Prairie, and you've also done a lot of work building up Omaha's ecosystem. What would you say the current status is of Omaha's startup community, and even Nebraska's as a whole?
I think that it kind of ebbs and flows, right? Mm-hmm. But if I think back to when we started Silicon Prairie News, which was in 2008, right? So it's been 13 years. Nobody was talking about this stuff at all. There was nobody, there's certainly nobody talking about it. And there were very few examples that you could actually point to that were interesting. I was one of the reasons we started is because I wanted to move to California, and because that's where cool companies are, and then met a girl and never left.
Okay.
And
classic.
and then I was looking around saying I want to hang out with cool technology startup people, where are they? And there were a handful of people, but not a lot. You couldn't list them off. And it sort of ebbs and flows, of course, if you look at the state. And Omaha's gone up and down, Lincoln's gone up and down. But I think these days, you can point to a half a dozen companies that are that are interesting by my definition, that are at scale, right? Flywheel, Spreetail, Buildertrend, Huddle, right? Like in those categories.
What defines them as interesting?
I don't know. Interesting technology, scalable, like reasonably cool culture. Like it's the kind of place that I would want to go work at. Like all of those sorts of things. And software enabled, these kind of things. There's, I don't know, probably a dozen that are at moderate scale that are interesting in that category, right? Like Open Doors is in this category. There's probably a dozen there. And then there's a whole bunch of like early stage stuff. A company I just invested in, Logica, like is just getting started. It's second time founder. Like that's awesome. Like there's like workshops in that category of like, hey, they're starting to see some momentum there. And so 10 years ago, you literally couldn't draw that picture. And so I think, so not only is there more companies, there's more just momentum and chatter and money and like stuff. And so I always say like we're not great, but we're trending upwards.
What could be improved about both Nebraska and Omaha startup community?
Well, I think that it's probably three things for me. One is you need more like seeing that it's a possibility, right? And so I think exits help with this, right? Like I think scale of companies helps with this. They look at it and they're like, oh man, look, it's possible here. So I think that just takes time. It takes visibility of deals and it takes visibility to companies in order to do that. And two, I think that capital is always a problem and a constraint, and it's getting better, right? There's more availability, but you have to have full cycle capital. So it's not enough to have angels who will write checks, because if you can't raise a Series A, then you're sunk, and if you can't raise a Series B, then you're sunk. And actually, and ironically, COVID, I think, accelerated this for places like Omaha and Lincoln and Nebraska generally, where you're like nobody's getting on planes anymore, and nobody's complaining about the fact that you're in Omaha. When we raised money for Flywheel, the number one complaint is we were in Omaha, Nebraska. And we're trying to convince them that that's an asset, not a liability. And now with COVID and Zoom, like nobody gives a shit.
Yeah.
And so that's the other thing. And I think the third is that you want this cycle of people who go and they learn how to scale companies. They're along for that ride. They make big contributions there, and then they go off and do their own thing. And it's sort of like, not only do they think it's possible, they have the actual skill to do it. And my partners at Workshop are this, right? They left Flywheel after 3 or 4 years to go build their own thing and then sell it. And that's awesome. And you're seeing that time, like in an increasing sort of rate of like, as the companies get bigger, people leave there to like take that knowledge and go start new things. And so all of those things in a way just take time, and ecosystems take a long time to develop and mature. But those are the things that I look at as like major high impact.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. And last question for you, Dusty. And I'm stealing it from, you did a interview with Tom Chapman at Mug.News, and he ended his interview by asking, like, what can our audience and our community do to support you with Workshop?
Yeah. Well, I think that the number one thing that I think that a local community can do to support a startup is just be customers or introduce to customers, right? We're looking for, companies between 100 and 500 people who have an internal communications problem. That's literally every one of them, So if somebody knows somebody in those orgs that is in HR or is in marketing or internal communications, then an introduction. And it doesn't even have to be a sales pitch on our side. Like, I just want to listen. Like, honestly, I just like, if somebody was like, hey, my friend does this, they're not interested in buying anything, I'd be like, perfect. I just want to learn. And I think that companies at our scale should be able to leverage. Omaha's a hyper-connected city, and Nebraska is a hyper-connected state.
Absolutely.
And you're like 1 degree separated from literally anybody in the state, I think. And you can get to a certain level of traction as a company without having to like leave your back door. And if you can do that, then you figure out how to like, okay, yeah, those are relationships. That's not super scalable, but that gets you enough of a like momentum going to like understand real pain points. Then you figure out how to scale it and quadruple it and 10x and 100x it. And I think that's the number one thing for me, right? Like we don't need, maybe referrals to people who are looking to looking for jobs or whatever. But like, I actually think that's the number one thing. Not only just for Workshop, I can point at 10 early stage companies and say like, man, if 10 people in this audience made a referral to each one of them of a new customer, that's literally game changing for those companies.
Yes, yeah, and especially at that stage that you highlighted Workshop being in.
You're just listening. You're just like learning, and you're like, if one out of those 10 buys, that's great. But if you listen to all 10 of them and they tell you interesting things that help you down the road, even better. And so I think that's the number one thing for me.
Yes, yeah. Well, Dusty, thank you for joining us. Really appreciated this conversation, and we should check back in like 6 months.
Let's do it.
Yes, to see how this grows and develops over time. Thank you for listening to today's episode of The Commonwealth. The show is edited by Kyle Kua, produced by Hunter Bergman, and with social media promotions ran by Ashley Hansen. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave us a review and share the link with your friends. We are a product of KZUM Radio and Herd App Media, and we also drop episodes every single Monday, so hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a beat.